Imagine a German field marshal, one of the most brilliant minds in military history, watching in disbelief as his elite forces crumble under an onslaught he never saw coming. In the early days of 1943, Erwin Rommel had dismissed the American army as a ragtag group of novices, unfit for the brutal realities of war. Yet, by the war's end, his comrades whispered in awe and dread about the same soldiers who had evolved into an unstoppable force. What turned these perceived amateurs into the nightmare of the Wehrmacht? How did a nation ridiculed for its inexperience forge a military machine that redefined modern warfare? Stay with us as we uncover the untold layers of this transformation, revealing secrets that even seasoned history buffs might not know, from hidden innovations in the desert sands to the strategic genius that shattered Nazi defenses. This isn't just a tale of battles, it's the story of how adaptability and ingenuity changed the course of history forever. The roots of this epic shift trace back to the interwar years, when the world was still reeling from the Great War. In 1918, American doughboys had charged into the fray late, earning respect for their grit but criticism for their raw tactics. German analysts noted their enthusiasm but highlighted a lack of polish, frontal assaults without the finesse of seasoned Europeans. Fast forward to 1939. The U.S. Army was a shadow of its potential, ranking below even smaller nations like Portugal in size. Its factories churned out consumer goods, not weapons of war. Nazi propaganda amplified this, portraying America as a divided melting pot, weakened by diversity and isolationism. Hitler himself scoffed, predicting that such a society couldn't endure the grind of total war. His inner circle echoed this, viewing racial purity as the key to martial supremacy, while America's immigrant heritage spelled inevitable frailty. But beneath the surface, seeds of revolution were sprouting. In quiet corners like Fort Sill, Oklahoma, visionaries reimagined artillery not as isolated firepower but as a symphony of destruction. They developed centralized fire direction centers, where any observer could summon batteries from across the battlefield, slashing response times from over 10 minutes to under 3. This wasn't just technical wizardry, it was a philosophical leap, emphasizing coordination over chaos. Meanwhile, American industry began gearing up, standardizing production in ways that would later flood the front lines with reliable gear. These quiet preparations set the stage for a rude awakening in North Africa. Enter the Kasserine Pass, February 1943, a crucible that exposed America's green edges. Under Major General Lloyd Fredendall, U.S. forces spread thin across rugged terrain, their command post buried miles from the action in a lavish underground bunker. Rommel's Afrika Korps struck like lightning, exploiting gaps with precision panzer maneuvers honed in years of desert combat. American tanks, lacking infantry cover, fell to the legendary 88mm guns. Units fragmented, retreating in disarray over 50 miles, leaving behind a trail of abandoned equipment and shattered morale. Casualties mounted to over 6,000 in days, with thousands captured. Omar Bradley labeled it the U.S. Army's nadir, a harsh lesson in leadership voids and untested troops. Yet this defeat wasn't the end, it was the spark. Eisenhower swiftly replaced Fredendall with George S. Patton, a whirlwind of discipline who instilled rigor overnight. Uniforms sharpened, training intensified, and a culture of excellence took hold. Patton's mantra: speed and audacity. He fined sloppy officers, demanded neckties in combat zones, and forged unity from chaos. What Rommel saw next defied his expectations. At El Getter in March, just weeks later, Americans turned the tide. Mines funneled German tanks into kill zones, while infantry held firm. But the real game changer? That innovative artillery system unleashed a barrage so synchronized it seemed otherworldly. Shells from multiple calibers landed simultaneously in time-on-target strikes, obliterating advances without warning. The 10th Panzer Division lost 30 tanks in hours, their survivors shell-shocked. Captured Germans admitted this was unprecedented, stopped cold by guns and grit alone. This rapid pivot highlighted America's unique strength, a learning army. Unlike rigid hierarchies, U.S. forces encouraged bottom-up innovation. Units shared tactics informally, adapting faster than foes could counter. In Tunisia's closing acts, Allies captured 275,000 Axis troops, more than at Stalingrad, proving the transformation was real. Rommel, in private letters, conceded the Americans' tactical growth, hinting at their future prowess. Little did he know, this was merely the prelude to Normandy's thunder. As we delve deeper, you'll discover how these early lessons exploded into the hedgerow breakthroughs and the Bulge's defiance, with fresh insights into overlooked heroes and technologies that tipped the scales. The journey from mockery to mastery holds lessons for today, about resilience, diversity's power, and the human spirit's boundless potential. The transformation that began in the Tunisian desert didn't stop at Al Gheder. It accelerated into something the Germans could scarcely comprehend, an army that learned at lightning speed, fueled by industrial might and a culture that turned every setback into fuel for improvement. German soldiers who survived North Africa carried tales back to Europe of American artillery that didn't just fire, it orchestrated devastation with mechanical precision. What terrified them wasn't merely the number of shells, though America's factories produced ammunition in quantities that dwarfed anything the Wehrmacht could sustain. It was the system behind the fire. Developed in the interwar years at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, the American Fire Direction Center revolutionized how artillery operated. Unlike German or British setups, where batteries often worked in isolation with slower coordination, the U.S. system centralized control at the battalion level. Any forward observer, whether on the ground, in a jeep, or circling in a tiny Piper Cub observation plane, could request fire from any available battery within range. Requests cascaded upward if needed, allowing entire divisions or corps to concentrate dozens, even hundreds of guns on a single target in minutes. Response times dropped dramatically, often to under 3 minutes from call to impact. German crews, accustomed to 10 or 12 minutes for similar massing, found themselves under sudden, overwhelming barrages before they could reposition or dig in deeper. This speed created psychological terror. German veterans described the dread of spotting those fragile Piper Cubs overhead. The plane itself posed no direct threat, no bombs, no guns, but its radio linked directly to the Fire Direction Center. Within moments, shells began falling with eerie accuracy, adjusted in real time as the observer walked the fire across positions. Then came the innovation of time-on-target missions. Batteries at different distances and with varying calibers calculated firing times so precisely that all projectiles arrived simultaneously. No gradual buildup, no warning salvos, just instantaneous saturation. Silence shattered into chaos as the sky seemed to collapse in a single, cataclysmic instant. Infantry in foxholes, tanks in hull-down positions, command posts. Nothing escaped the storm. Captured Germans often spoke of this as the most horrifying aspect of facing Americans. Artillery that struck like judgment from above, relentless and inescapable. The terror deepened with the proximity fuse, introduced in late 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. This tiny radar device, fitting inside a standard shell, detected the ground and detonated at optimal height, around 30 feet, for maximum fragmentation. Conventional shells buried themselves before exploding, wasting energy in the dirt. Airbursts showered shrapnel downward, turning foxholes into death traps and multiplying lethality 5 to 10 times against dug-in troops. In the frozen Ardennes, where Germans expected their elite divisions to punch through, proximity-fused rounds shredded entire formations. Some soldiers preferred charging directly into American lines rather than endure the invisible rain of steel from above. Patton himself marveled at its effects, noting how one concentrated barrage wiped out scores in seconds. The device, developed in utmost secrecy at a cost rivaling early atomic research, represented America's ability to weaponize innovation on an industrial scale. But artillery was only the most visible multiplier. American logistics created an aura of inexhaustibility that haunted German planners. When a Sherman tank burned, another arrived within days from vast depots. Ammunition flowed in endless convoys, while German batteries rationed shells and juggled captured foreign guns with mismatched calibers and parts. One American battalion fired its 300,000th round in less than a year, more than some German corps expended in the entire war. Every division rolled fully motorized, while much of the Wehrmacht still relied on horses for supply. Close air support arrived with terrifying swiftness, forward controllers directing fighter bombers to targets in minutes. This combined arms symphony, ground, air, logistics, made isolated German brilliance futile against systemic dominance. Normandy's bocage country tested this evolution in brutal fashion. Ancient hedgerows, dense earthen banks topped with thick vegetation, turned every field into a fortress. Tanks climbing over exposed vulnerable undersides to anti-tank fire. Infantry advances stalled under interlocking machine gun fire. 4 weeks after D-Day, gains measured in yards cost thousands of lives. German commanders, watching the stalemate, briefly hoped history would repeat. Americans crumbling under terrain that favored defense, just as at Kasserine. They underestimated American adaptability. Without waiting for top-down orders, units innovated grassroots solutions. Tank crews welded steel prongs repurposed from German beach obstacles, onto Shermans, creating rhino devices that tore through hedgerows at ground level instead of climbing. Sergeant Curtis Cullen's design, inspired by a simple suggestion to add saw teeth, spread rapidly through informal networks. Bradley witnessed a demonstration and ordered mass production. Within weeks, most First Army tanks sported these cutters. Infantry developed new clearing tactics, coordinating with tanks and artillery in sequences never before formalized. Engineers tested explosives and mechanical aids, sharing successes laterally. This bottom-up ingenuity culminated in Operation Cobra on July 25, 1944. A massive carpet bombing by 1,500 heavy bombers saturated a narrow rectangle, annihilating the elite Panzer Lehr division in hours. Over 1,000 Germans perished, vehicles reduced to smoking hulks. Survivors emerged to face a ground assault that poured through the breach. Patton's Third Army surged forward in a blitz of its own, covering ground faster than any prior campaign. Columns appeared in German rear areas, severing supply lines and trapping divisions. The Falaise pocket became a graveyard. 10,000 Germans killed, 50,000 captured amid mountains of wreckage that one general likened to a scene from Dante. German assessments evolved dramatically. Where they once dismissed Americans as amateurs, post-war interrogations revealed grudging respect. Guderian, the Blitzkrieg architect, praised Patton's mobile warfare as something he himself would have executed. Others admitted the war was lost the moment American momentum shattered in France. Yet they distinguished Americans from British foes. The British earned professional admiration, methodical, predictable, allowing time for countermeasures. Montgomery's set-piece battles followed patterns Germans could anticipate: visible buildups, prolonged bombardments, deliberate advances. Von Rundstedt concentrated reserves against Americans precisely because their attacks carried less warning and exploited breakthroughs with unnerving speed. What Germans feared most wasn't individual American soldiers and raw combat prowess. It was the system, overwhelming firepower multiplied by coordination, logistics that never faltered, and an organization that learned from failure faster than doctrine predicted. The army that panicked at Kasserine became the one that no Wehrmacht force could contain by 1944. This wasn't superhuman ability, it was ordinary people rising through extraordinary institutional support, turning diversity and industrial power into battlefield dominance. The final proof came in the Ardennes, Hitler's last gamble. Elite divisions struck through fog and snow, expecting collapse like Tunisia. Instead, isolated stands, like 18 men at Lanzerath Ridge holding off 500 paratroopers for 18 hours, bought critical time. At Elsenborn Ridge, divisions blocked the main thrust with artillery storms that decimated SS units. At Bastogne, encircled defenders answered surrender demands with one defiant word: nuts. Patton pivoted an entire army northward through winter hell to relieve them. Churchill himself hailed it as America's greatest victory of the war. By war's end, the journey from contempt to fear was complete. The Americans who once fled became the relentless force that broke an empire. Their secret? Not invincible warriors, but a system that amplified every individual's potential, and adapted relentlessly until victory was inevitable. The Battle of the Bulge wasn't merely Hitler's final offensive. It was the ultimate test of whether the American transformation from Kasserine amateurs to relentless professionals had truly taken root. Launched on December 16, 1944, through dense Ardennes fog and snow that grounded Allied air forces, German panzers achieved complete surprise. Elite SS divisions sliced through thinly held lines, aiming to reach the Meuse River bridges and split the Allied front. Many German commanders privately believed the Americans would fracture under the shock, just as they had in Tunisia nearly 2 years earlier. The early gains seemed to confirm this hope. American units retreated in confusion, roads clogged with panicked traffic, and headlines screamed of another disaster. But the cracks in German optimism appeared almost immediately. Small, desperate stands began to unravel the timetable. At Lanzerath Ridge, 18 men from an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, reinforced by 4 artillery observers, faced 500 Fallschirmjäger paratroopers. For nearly 18 hours they held a critical crossroads against repeated assaults, inflicting heavy casualties and delaying the entire northern thrust by a full day. When ammunition finally ran dry, they withdrew, having bought priceless time for reinforcements. That tiny group would later become one of the most decorated American units of its size in the entire war. Further north, at Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, supported by the 1st Infantry Division on the southern flank, formed an unbreakable wall. The Germans hurled their finest remaining armor, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, against them in wave after wave. What followed was a masterclass in American artillery dominance. Proximity-fused shells rained down in airbursts, shredding infantry in open ground and forcing panzers to halt under relentless barrages. Time-on-target concentrations turned entire assault corridors into killing fields. The Hitlerjugend, indoctrinated fanatics who had expected to steamroll toward Antwerp, suffered catastrophic losses and never recovered combat effectiveness. German after-action reports described the fire as apocalyptic, shells arriving without warning, saturating positions so completely that survival seemed impossible. The most legendary episode unfolded at Bastogne. Surrounded by overwhelming forces, the 101st Airborne Division, bolstered by Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Tank Destroyers and stragglers from shattered units, refused to yield. When a German delegation demanded surrender to avoid needless bloodshed, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe delivered history's most famous one-word reply: nuts. The defenders held through bitter cold and ceaseless attacks, their perimeter shrinking but never breaking. Meanwhile, Patton executed one of the war's greatest feats. He pivoted his entire Third Army 90 degrees northward, marched over 100 miles through snow-choked roads in freezing conditions, and smashed through German lines to relieve Bastogne on December 26. The speed and audacity stunned even German observers who had once dismissed American mobility. By January 1945 the offensive collapsed. Germany had committed its last strategic reserves, men, tanks, fuel, and lost them all. The Ardennes became another graveyard of panzer divisions, with tens of thousands killed or captured. Winston Churchill, rarely effusive about American efforts, addressed Parliament with rare candor. This was, he declared, undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war and would forever stand as one of its most famous victories. The contrast with German views of other allies sharpened dramatically in these final months. British forces earned consistent professional respect, methodical planners whose set-piece operations followed predictable rhythms. Massive buildups, prolonged preliminary bombardments, and deliberate advances gave German intelligence days to prepare countermeasures. Von Rundstedt had deliberately concentrated his mobile reserves against the Americans in Normandy precisely because British caution granted breathing room, while American attacks arrived with less preamble and exploited breakthroughs with frightening unpredictability. Canadians drew descriptions of ruthlessness in close combat. But Americans carried a different weight, overwhelming, relentless, terrifying in their sheer systemic power. What the Wehrmacht truly feared was never individual marksmanship or raw courage alone. It was the integrated machine, artillery that could summon hundreds of guns in minutes, air support that made daylight movements suicidal, logistics that replaced losses faster than they occurred, and an organizational culture that treated every reverse as data for rapid improvement. Where German doctrine emphasized individual initiative within rigid frameworks, the American approach encouraged grassroots innovation that spread organically and outpaced centralized planning. Hedgerow cutters born from Sergeant Cullen's ingenuity, fire control systems refined at Fort Sill, proximity fuses developed in secret labs. These weren't isolated inventions. They were symptoms of a deeper strength, a nation that could mobilize diversity, industry, and adaptability on an unprecedented scale. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the consequences became undeniable. German cities lay in ruins from unopposed bombing. Factories that once armed the Wehrmacht stood silent. Fuel depots stood empty. Strategic reserves vanished. German soldiers fought on with stubborn valor, but without illusion. The men who had panicked under Rommel's first blow in February 1943 were often the same ones who now accepted surrenders in May. They had grown not into supermen, but into professionals supported by the most powerful military ecosystem the world had ever seen. Post-war interrogations revealed the depth of that shift. Guderian, the father of Blitzkrieg, openly admired Patton's mobile operations. Other generals admitted the war was irretrievably lost the moment American momentum shattered their lines in France. Rommel himself, before his death, had begun to recognize the Americans' accelerating competence in Tunisia. The journey from contemptuous dismissal to genuine dread spanned barely 2 years, a blink in military history, yet it reshaped the 20th century. This story endures not because Americans were inherently superior, but because they proved capable of extraordinary evolution when tested. Ordinary men from every corner of a vast continent, farmers, factory workers, students, rose through training, experience, and institutional learning to become something their enemies learned to fear. They turned early humiliation into ultimate victory not through magic, but through relentless adaptation, overwhelming coordination, and the quiet determination to improve. That legacy reminds us that true strength lies not in never failing, but in how quickly and completely one recovers from failure. It shows what happens when a diverse society channels its collective ingenuity into a common purpose. And it explains why, decades later, those who faced the Americans on the ground still spoke of them in tones reserved for something unprecedented. Not just another army, but a force that learned faster, hit harder, and never stopped coming. If this journey through one of history's most remarkable military transformations moved you, give the video a like to help share these stories. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the Second World War's hidden turning points. Drop a comment below. Did any part of this surprise you? Do you have family stories from these campaigns? Your thoughts keep these histories alive. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.